Hello and welcome to this lecture on Plato's Republic, Book 4 for Introduction to Philosophy. And now we're really getting into the central questions of the book, and we're really starting to see what Plato's answers are going to look like and how this is going to play out. So once we finish with this discussion and this study of Book 4, we'll have a really good platform for seeing what Plato wants to do, and we'll be in a good position to see where the dialogue moves in the next chapter, with a lot of sort of concrete suggestions about the good city and what follows in terms of the further education of the guardians. So let's crack on with Book 4. Okay, so the sort of order and arrangement and organization we end up with at the end of chapter 4 looks something like this, where we've sort of distinguished the parts of the city that emerged at the end of book 3. We've got the rulers who are called the true guardians at the end of book 3, and they're distinguished from the auxiliaries, who are now the kind of warrior class, or the sort of military class of sort of protective, the sort of protective work of protecting the city and making sure order is established and maintained. And then everybody else, the common folk, the producers, the farmers and craftsmen at the bottom, who either farm the land or produce commodities for sale. So that's the three-part order of the just city, and it's a kind of tri-functional arrangement that Plato sets up. Before the modern era, there are a lot of examples of sort of tri-functional societies that were gradually overcome and transitioned into more modern societies. But typically in these societies, there was one class that was dedicated towards meaning, and that was usually the clergy. There was another class, the nobles, who were sort of dedicated towards protection, and the mass of people were the kind of third class. So Plato's own sort of perfect city, the just city, is a kind of tri-functional order like those, where of course it's the auxiliaries here. There's a warrior class similar to a lot of tri-functional societies, and instead of the clergy, which of course is more typical in kind of nominally Christian tri-functional societies, what we have here are rulers who know the good, as we'll see, and those are that's the class of people who will be the rulers of the sort of rulers. They would sort of decide on the sort of meanings that matter for the just city and the goals and all of that kind of thing. So in this chapter we'll see the virtues, and we'll see how they relate to the parts of the city, and we'll also distinguish the parts of the soul as well. And these two things, as we'll see, are really fundamental for Socrates' response to Glaucon and the challenge of Gyges' ring, and we'll see a kind of response emerging through the virtues and the parts of the soul and the importance of the soul. We'll see that answer emerging at the end of book 4. So part of the task here is to kind of remember, we went from the sort of city, that we went from thinking about justice to thinking about the city, because Socrates told us that the letters are bigger and it's easier to see. But we were promised that at some point we would sort of shrink that down and go back from the parts of the city to the sort of individual and the parts of the soul. So back from the community to the individual, and we'll see that happen in book 4. However, the very start of the book begins with a complaint by Adeimatus, and this is triggered by something that Socrates mentions right at the end of book 3. It's the last discussion, the last passage in book 3, when Socrates is talking about how the guardians are to be, how they're going to live, how they're going to be communally housed, how they're not going to have access to gold and silver, but they won't care because they're told they'll have gold and silver in their souls. So Adeimatus, right at the beginning of Book 4, raises this complaint. And he starts by using this phrase. He says, "What would your apology be, Socrates?" The word here in the original text, apologia, is an important word. And of course, it refers back to Socrates' apology to the Athenians, which is in essence his trial speech, his sort of trial defense, his defense of himself before the Athenians. And it's interesting, we see that language articulated here and taken up here as well. What would your defense be, Socrates? How would you defend yourself? And of course, that's part of what we've seen in this book from the beginning, that Socrates is almost sort of forced here to give an account of himself. Remember, he's forcibly brought to the house of Cephalus in the first book, and this sort of sense that Socrates is on trial is very much enhanced here by these references to apologia and the sort of how Socrates is going to make a defense speech in favor of himself. And here it's with reference to those ideas that he's just said. The guardians, the rulers of the city, are to live an incredibly Spartan existence. They're to live in common. They're to be provided meals, but nothing extra. They're not allowed to own property. And something about families was mentioned too, which we'll return to in the next chapter. And Adeimatus says, "You're hardly making these men happy, and further that it's their own fault. They to whom the city in truth belongs." Note this language here. So for Adeimatus, and again, this sort of takes us back to Thrasymachus' thinking, right? The rulers have the city to themselves. It's their city to control and use as they wish. And listen to Adeimatus' complaint here. "They to whom the city in truth belongs, but who enjoy nothing good from the city, as do others who possess lands and build big, fine houses." So the producers are allowed, the sort of producing class are allowed to sort of build houses and possess property. Of course, we know that's going to be limited to a degree, but the people who are in charge, the rulers, the guardians, they are not allowed to own any property. And all of these things that, the gold and silver, the entertaining foreigners, all of these things that they're not allowed to do. But he would say they look exactly like mercenary auxiliaries who sit in the city and do nothing but keep watch. Right. So it doesn't look a very attractive existence for Adeimatus when he's thinking, okay, well, if I would desire a life like this, what would it look like? And if it looks this sort of Spartan and barren and empty of the good things of life, what's good about it? So this is the task that Socrates has, to persuade that this is the way that things ought to be. Socrates' response, "Yes, I said, and besides they do it for food alone. They get no wages beyond food." And all it goes on to sort of, they can't give gifts to lady companions. All of these kind of privileges that are part of wealth, that are part of being in control, and part of the wealth and privilege that comes with ruling. And Socrates is sort of taking those things away, and making that look a lot less attractive to somebody like Adeimatus, who wants big things, who wants nice things, who wants luxurious things, and is not happy with this suggestion of Socrates. But this is really important. This idea that those who look after the public good and look after the good of the city as a whole are to be entirely public spirited. Everything that would allow them to have a private interest, which would be in contrast with the public interest, all of that is taken away. And Socrates, he does this thing here where the division between public and private, which in our society is mixed. There's no absolute division. Private citizens become politicians, become rulers. Right, Socrates is dividing those two things into separate classes. There's a separate class of public-spirited citizens, and what keeps them public-spirited is their lack of those sort of private things and private privileges and luxuries that drive a wedge between looking out for the public interest and satisfying your own sort of private interests. Now, Socrates' response to Eudaimus' charges is very illuminating and really worth taking a note of. He says basically to Eudaimus, well, what we're trying to do is make a happy city, not a few happy individuals we can put into it, right? So it's as though Socrates is saying, well, you know, you're looking at the rulers and saying, why don't they have luxuries? Why don't they have all these privileges? Why can't they entertain their lady friends and all of this kind of stuff? And Socrates says, well, we're not thinking about the happiness of individuals. We're trying to create a happy city, right? And he says, we must let nature assign to each of the groups its share of happiness. So there's the importance of nature again, as opposed to convention, right? What's happening here, Socrates is assuring us, is that the just city is being built up from this idea of what is naturally good and naturally suited and naturally fulfilling to each of the groups in terms of what they're good at, right? So the groups are assigned to the separate classes based on their nature, and it's because that's in their nature that they will get their share of happiness from doing the things which they are naturally best suited to do. Now, notice this problem actually emerges from the move that Socrates took in chapter 2 when he blew up the picture and said, hey, instead of looking for the just individual, let's look at the just city and let's try and find that, right? And then we can sort of think about the happy individual, right? So what's happened here is that we've created the just city, right? And what we're calling here the happy city, right? We've created the just city, and let's presume for the moment that it is perfectly just and everything else. But Eudaimus is saying, but look at the rulers. Surely we can imagine them more happy with more luxuries, more privileges than this, right? But Socrates is focused on the city as a whole and each group fulfilling its function. But now we can see that the focus on the city as a whole raises the question of which individuals are going to be happy. What does happiness mean here on the individual level in the happy city, right? So this whole problem is created by blowing the thing up, looking at the happy city, and then thinking about individuals, right? And it's that creates this problem of happiness. And Socrates is saying it's up to nature to assign individuals their share of happiness. Now, related to this is that the just city has a kind of natural meritocracy. And we like to think of ourselves today as a kind of meritocratic society. And that just means the sense that people sort of are allowed to strive for whatever position they wish, and where they actually end up is a result of their own talents and abilities. That's the idea of meritocracy. Of course, some people may say, well, that's not really the way things are. There's a lot of sort of privileges, and if you're born wealthy, etc., etc. This is how the idea of meritocracy is going to work in the city Socrates is constructing. And he says, and still slighter than that, I said, is what we mentioned earlier when we said that if a child of slight ability were born of the guardians, he would have to be sent off to the others. And if a serious one were born of the others, he would have to be sent off to the guardians. This was intended to make plain that each of the other citizens too must be brought to that which naturally, note the naturally again here, what naturally suits him. One man, one job, so that each man practicing his own, which is one, will not become many but one, and thus you see the whole city will naturally grow to be one and not many, right? So this natural meritocracy works by everybody being given the position that they're fitted, that they're suited to by nature. And if a child born to the guardians should be in the producing class, that's where that child goes. If a child born to the producing class should be in the guardians, that's where that child goes. So there's a kind of testing of the ability of children and the assigning of children to their sort of natural position. Now, there's the assumption here about this sort of natural function or natural position, which sounds odd for us today, where we think, you know, people should have choice and maybe people sort of change and start here and sort of end up somewhere else. So that's a kind of meritocracy. We might say a kind of fault of our meritocracy insofar as it exists is that, you know, it's very easy, for people to store privileges, for the wealthy to sort of store privileges for their children so that their children become wealthy as well, even if they're actually not that talented. But that's a problem that doesn't arise in the natural meritocracy that Socrates is creating. Everybody is sort of evaluated and tested, and each child is sent to where they are naturally best fitted. So there's no sort of parental privilege that interferes with that. It's a more natural meritocracy, I think, than any that we would be familiar with in that sense. The sort of, I think the odd thing here is the sense of people being assigned for life to particular functions. That sounds odd and sounds not right to us, but there's certainly an element of meritocracy in the way that this is set up. All right, now let's talk about the virtues and the way they work for Socrates in the Just City. Virtue comes from the word arete, the Greek word arete, which actually means something close to excellence or goodness. So to have a virtue is to possess a kind of excellence in the character you need to excel and be good at an important aspect of human activity, right? So the things you need for the Greeks to be sort of athletically, to be sort of excellent in an athletic sense, in a kind of sense of being a soldier or a warrior, in a sense of being a thinker, in a sense of being a sort of skilled craftsman. You need a certain set of good traits of character, and those things are the virtues. All right, so we go through, in this part, Socrates takes us through the 4 virtues of the good city, and the first one we encounter is wisdom. And we find out here that this is something that is about the affairs of the city as a whole, something that counsels not about the affairs connected with some particular things Socrates says, but about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and the other cities. So wisdom is that knowledge that looks out for the good of the city as a whole. So it's not just some sort of neutral expertise, it's not some neutral skill, it's a knowledge that looks out for the good of the city as a whole and the good of all of the groups in it together. And that skill is named wisdom, and Socrates says that it's the rulers who possess this particular virtue. So this virtue is found in the city among the rulers or the perfect guardians. The second virtue that's found is the virtue of courage. And interestingly, this is defined as the right and lawful opinion as what is terrible and what is not, which is a kind of odd way to define courage, because we don't think of it as an opinion. We think of it as a kind of trait, a kind of strength that allows us to kind of resist and sort of hold back our inclinations. But Socrates the reason he says that is because he intends it as a kind of consistency, as a kind of consistent sticking to one's principles, so that, say, even in a fearful situation, you don't act any differently than your opinion of how you should act, but you continue to do the right thing. So it's sort of the maintaining of that opinion of what's the right thing to do, regardless of what the situation is and regardless of what the particular dangers in the particular situation are. So that's how he defines courage, and it's associated with the auxiliaries, the warriors, and it makes sense that they are the ones who are to have this virtue of courage for protecting the city. The third virtue that's discovered is moderation, and moderation is defined as a certain kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires, as men say when they use, I don't know in what way, the phrase stronger than himself, and some other phrases of that sort are used that are, as it were, its tracks. Isn't that so? So moderation is a kind of self-control or a kind of self-mastery, and it's being sort of master of one's desires, master of one's urges, able to control those for the sake of a greater good or a higher purpose. So moderation actually runs throughout the city. It's not located in any single group, but each part of the city is supposed to have this virtue of self-mastery, which makes it able to sort of to master the urges that would sort of lead it astray or sort of knock it off balance, and be able to sort of master those urges that don't accord with what your goals and purposes are. And finally, we get to the virtue of justice, the final virtue, after a bit of a song and dance, and Socrates sort of enlists everybody's help in order to find it. And finally, it's defined as minding one's own business, which is, again, a very strange definition. But let's have a look at how Socrates defines it here. He says, now, if you see if you have the same opinion as I do, a carpenter trying to do the job of a shoemaker, or a shoemaker that of a carpenter, or they're exchanging tools or honors, right? So that's what's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be so everybody doing their own thing, and it's partly this idea of one man, one job, everybody doing the function for which they're best suited. That's what Socrates means here by justice as minding one's own business. And he talks here in this passage of meddling, that this sort of changing crafts and meddling are the destruction of the city. Meddling among the classes, of which there are three, and exchange with one another is the greatest harm for the city and would be called most extreme evildoing, right? So meddling among the classes, meaning, you know, certain classes doing things for which they're not best suited, the producers ruling, the rulers being warriors, right? Those are things that are not according to nature. Those are things that are not according to the natural function of the city. So individuals doing things for which they're not suited, which is not their function, that's the counter of justice. Justice is everybody doing their function and minding their own business, not trying to do something which belongs to the function and the realm of somebody else. So it's a very kind of functional idea of justice, everybody doing their thing. When everything falls into place, Socrates says, and everything else is where it's supposed to be, justice is simply the kind of arrangement that happens when everything is doing its rightful thing and nothing is in the wrong place. Okay, now that we've gone through the virtues, now we're going to try and shrink the city down to the soul. And the idea here again is we're kind of reversing the move that was made in chapter 2 when we looked at the big letters of the city to find justice. Well, now that we've found justice and we've found this idea of justice as a sort of idea of not meddling, of minding one's own business, keeping to one's own function, now we've got to shrink that down and see if we can find a kind of pattern in the soul, which is sort of the character of each individual, that matches the pattern in the city. And of course, when we talk about a soul, Socrates means a kind of spiritual constitution, the things that drive us, and give us meaning, and how we organize those spiritual parts of us in the service of a greater good. Okay, so there's a really interesting supposition made here by Socrates in the way he proceeds, and this is that the parts of the soul become evident in psychic conflict, right? So the question is, how would we recognize a part of the soul? How would we identify something as being a part of the soul? And Socrates says, well, in order to do that, we've got to sort of introspect. We've got to try and be aware of what's going on. And when we notice a case of psychic conflict, that's when we might recognize parts of the soul. And what he means by psychic conflict is, it's like we're pulling in different directions, right? We want something and at the same time we don't want it. We want to do something and at the same time we don't want to do it. We have both feelings at the same time. We have a conflict. When that happens, it's because parts of our soul are pulling in different directions. And when we feel that, we can kind of identify them and see what they're doing and distinguish them from each other. Okay, so there are two particular conflicts that enable us to do this. So we're going to sort of go through those conflicts now. Now, the first one that emerges, and this is really a really simple one. There are so many cases of this conflict, if we think about it. The conflict between desire and reason. Socrates says, now would we assert that sometimes there are some men who are thirsty but not willing to drink, right? So if we sort of expand that in terms of desire, right, there are many occasions where we recognize that principle, right? We see a delicious piece of cake, but we don't want to eat it, right? Or we tell ourselves, well, we've had a lot of cake recently, it's not the right thing to do now, right? So this idea that that our desires are in conflict. Part of us wants to eat the cake, part of us wants to drink, but part of us also is pulling against that and saying it wouldn't be wise to do that now. It wouldn't be healthy to do that now. It wouldn't be the best for us to do that now. Let's not act on that desire, right? So this conflict between desire and reason are really, really prevalent in our lives, I think. And it's pretty easy to see that what's making the case against desire here is the capacity of reason, that we're saying, well, it's not wise to do it now, that now is not the right time, that it wouldn't be good for us, it wouldn't be good for our long-term health, right? All of those are the kind of claims made by a faculty that's designed to look after our long-term well-being and our long-term health, and that faculty is the faculty of reason, and that's contrasted with the faculty of desire, which is simply the sort of the awareness and the faculty that wants to fulfill itself as desire. It's desire for food, drink, sexual satisfaction, and sort of bodily pleasure. All of these things are sort of the realm of desire. Okay, now the second conflict also involves desire, but here we meet the third element of the soul, and that's going to be the element that we call spirit. Okay, it's kind of interesting how Socrates distinguishes these in the text. So let's have a look. This is on page 119. But, I said, I once heard something that I trust. Leontius, the son of Aglaon, was going up from the Piraeus under the outside of the north wall when he noticed corpses lying by the public executioner. He desired to look, but at the same time he was disgusted and made himself turn away. And for a while he struggled and covered his face. But finally, overpowered by the desire, he opened his eyes wide, ran towards the corpses and said, "Look, you damn wretches, take your fill of the fair sight." "I have heard it," he said. "This speech," I said, "certainly indicates that anger sometimes makes war against the desires as one thing against something else." So here we have another principle emerging here, a kind of anger, a kind of spirited aggression, that sort of, so, and if we look at the example, what's happening is that this he's taking a walk and sees these corpses near the public executioner and wants to have a look. But spirit, this faculty of anger, this sort of faculty that indicates our very sort of social emotions, regulates our self-esteem and our sense of pride. Our spirit discerns that it would be kind of shameful to look at corpses, so it tries to get desire to turn away. It tries to convince desire that it's shameful, but desire sort of wins out in the end. But that's the conflict here. It's kind of similar if you've ever been driving on a highway and you notice when there's an accident on the other side, people kind of slow down. There's a slowdown in traffic and everybody sort of takes a look, rubbernecking as they call it. Very similar to what's going on here, right? There's a desire to look at a tragedy. There's a desire to see horrific things, but there's a part of us that also tells us doing so is shameful. It's not right. It's not worthy. It's not socially acceptable to be looking at suffering and death. We must turn away. That's the conflict, right? And it's the conflict between desire and spirit that we see emerging in these cases. Okay, so now we can sort of fill in how we've sort of miniaturized the soul and look at all of these elements and how they fit together. So we've distinguished the three parts of the soul as reason, spirit, and desire. And those three parts of the soul have a hierarchical relation. It's a hierarchy, same as the sort of three classes in the just city, which are here given in quadrant 3. Right, so the classes in the good city are rulers. They're called here philosophers for reasons we'll get to a bit later on. But so rulers, philosophers, warriors, and commoners or producers. So in the soul, the order is reason. So reason is in charge. Reason knows the good and makes decisions based on our long-term good. Spirit is kind of the kind of equivalent to the warriors. It's sort of very prideful. It's this idea of what's in Greek is thumos or anger. It's sort of quick to rouse and defend our pride and our self-esteem. So that's the idea of spirit. And finally, desire, the sort of instant self-fulfillment and the sort of fulfillment of our physical needs. Again, that's the lowest element of the soul, compatible with the producers, the third class of citizens in the just city. Right. So there's a sort of principle that aligns with each part of the soul. For reason, it's knowledge. Reason has knowledge of the good, and so it acts on the basis of our sort of long-term well-being and tells us, right, when it tells us, not to eat the cake, it's telling us that on the basis of our potential long-term health and well-being. Spirit is oriented towards honor and self-esteem and is very sort of very attuned to things that undermine our honor and our social esteem. And just as the guardians are supposed to, or the auxiliaries are supposed to align with the guardians and the rulers, in the soul it's reason and spirit that are supposed to align. Excuse me. And if reason and spirit align, desire can be kept in its place. So it's a kind of hierarchy that works in the just city through the alliance of the guardians and the auxiliaries. In the soul, it works through the alliance of reason, working with spirit to keep the order, and in that way desire isn't able to get control and isn't able to win, and reason and spirit can sort of keep the right order in the soul. And we talked about the virtues. Wisdom, as we saw, is associated with the rulers, and it's also associated with reason. Courage is the sort of virtue associated with the class of warriors or auxiliaries. Moderation runs right through the city, so every part of the city is called to the task of self-mastery, of mastering their lower parts for the need of their higher parts. Justice, the sort of everything in its place also, of course, runs throughout the city. When everything is properly arranged, justice is simply the arrangement of everything being in its proper place. Okay, so this is what Socrates says about the alliance of reason and spirit. And these two, thus trained and having truly learned their own business and been educated, will be set over the desiring, which is surely most of the soul in each, and by nature most insatiable for money. And they'll watch it for fear of its being filled with the so-called pleasures of the body, and thus becoming big and strong, and then not minding its own business, right? This sort of the term for justice here, but attempting to enslave and rule what is not appropriately ruled by its class, and subverting everyone's entire life, right? So the alliance of spirit and reason prevents that sort of revolution from happening. It prevents the soul from being overturned, and it prevents desire from enslaving the other faculties and using them for its own purposes. So that's obviously the kind of worry for Socrates of what happens. And as we'll see, that's what happens when the idea of tyranny wins out in the soul, is this process of desire becoming paramount. So ultimately, this is going to be the basis of the criticism of Thrasymachus's view and the sort of tyrant's view of what happiness is, because for Socrates, that's a form of enslavement, where the soul is enslaved by desire and the tyrant himself is enslaved by desire, even though they may not be aware of that fact. Okay, we also encounter a very sort of clear statement that justice is established according to the principles of nature or physis, and is not merely a matter of convention. Socrates says, "Then in its turn, I said, isn't to produce justice to establish the parts of the soul in a relation of mastering and being mastered by one another, that is, according to nature. While to produce injustice is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another, that is contrary to nature." Entirely so, he said. "Virtue then, as it seems, would be a certain health, beauty, and good condition of a soul, and vice a sickness, ugliness, and weakness." So it is, right? So this idea that there's a sort of ordering that's according to nature, and that produces health, beauty, and the sort of good condition of the soul, and any ordering contrary to nature produces different forms of sickness, ugliness, and weakness. Right, so the argument is going to be that's what happens when a soul is badly ordered. We'll see later the idea of a sort of badly ordered city, and we'll sort of enumerate those and go through what they look like. Here it's the idea of a badly ordered soul, and here it leads to the vice of sickness and ugliness and so on, that we're unable to act according to nature. All right, so on page 125 we come to this rather interesting discussion, and it looks like Socrates has won the argument, at least up to this point. And he says, "So as it seems, it now remains for us to consider whether it is profitable to do just things, practice fine ones, and be just, whether or not one's being such remains unnoticed, or whether it is profitable to do injustice and be unjust, provided one doesn't pay the penalty and become better as a result of punishment." Right? So that's a restatement of Thrasymachus and the sort of problem there of whether it's better to be unjust, whether justice is the advantage of the stronger, as Thrasymachus said, the person who gets control of the city and says what justice is and gets all the riches, all the wealth, and all the fame and all the power, right? And here's what Glaucon responds here to Socrates at this point. "But Socrates, that inquiry looks to me as though it has become ridiculous by now. If life doesn't seem livable with the body's nature corrupted, not even with every sort of food and drink, and every sort of wealth and every sort of rule, Will it then be livable when the nature of that very thing by which we live is confused and corrupted, even if a man does whatever else he might want, except that which will rid him of vice and injustice, and will enable him to acquire justice and virtue? Isn't this clear now that all of these qualities have manifested their characters in our description? So it's clear they buy Socrates' arguments about the soul, in the sense that there's a kind of natural order that makes us healthy and allows us to achieve our good. And if we sort of set up a different order of the soul, one that allows desire to be in charge, where desire gets to sort of say what it wants and gets to sort of rake in as much wealth and power as it wants, right? It looks like happiness, but it's not the natural order of the soul that leads to human well-being. So it's a kind of corrupted form of happiness that is in effect, as we'll see later on when we get to the regimes and tyranny, in effect is a form of suffering. We might think of it as a kind of addiction, right? The person who is controlled by desire is sort of controlled by their addiction for things, but their capacity to reason, to sort of reason against desire and look out for their long-term good, that has become impossible. And everything is done for short-term desire, and reason sort of has no say. So a life lived in such a way, Socrates might well say looks like an addiction rather than a sort of form of happiness. That if we give in to desire, as it looks like Thrasymachus and others are encouraging us to do, what we get is not happiness, but a form of addiction that doesn't live up to the idea of the human good. All right, so let's sort of fill in a little bit before we finish Plato's answer to Glaucon and the challenge of Gyges' ring, which was the challenge set out in part 2. And we've just seen how Plato's idea of the soul gives a kind of answer to that question. And there's a number of parts that we can sort of look here, a number of claims that are important to really understand what this claim means and what this response means. So it's clear that for Socrates here in the case that he's laying out, being moral, being just, is a commitment to live a certain kind of life, to be a certain kind of person. Right? And that's a person who is ruled by reason, who looks out for their long-term good, etc. And that being that kind of person allows us to flourish as human beings. We've seen Socrates argue this is what's according to human nature. This is how we're supposed to flourish as people if we keep this natural order of the soul that's reflected in the functional order of the good city, living the kind of life and achieving the kind of goods that represent a life lived well according to human nature, right? So only if we sort of live in this way, that if we order our souls in this way, letting reason take charge, keeping desire in check, that's the only way we can have the kind of life according to nature that enables us to flourish, right? So the response to Thrasymachus and the sort of the Gyges ring view, which Glaucon puts forward at the beginning of chapter 2, is that self-interest or pleasure is far too narrow as a view of what makes human life worthwhile. Happiness is a byproduct of our efforts to make ourselves the best person we can be, whether that's intellectually, whether that's musically, whether that's athletically, or whatever it is that we happen to view as the good for ourselves. Right? We sort of pursue that good by our reason and our long-term efforts, and our happiness is a kind of a byproduct of all the things that we do in these activities that extend us and allow us to flourish and extend our capacities. So it's not like we're pursuing self-interest, we're pursuing our own good, we're pursuing our own flourishing, and our happiness is a kind of byproduct of that. So anything which starts from self-interest, like Gyges' ring, which assumes you can get happiness by doing entirely self-interested things, has a completely wrong and completely too narrow view of what makes human life worthwhile, right? It's not just about being able to amass wealth and power. It's about flourishing as humans who have an idea of our good and are able to pursue it. So it's activities that allow us to exercise self-mastery and allow us to extend and develop our capacities, whether they be intellectual, musical, athletic, or whatever, are the key to self-fulfillment. And doing this requires our long-term focus and commitment. And of course, the long-term focus and commitment requires us to be ruled by reason and requires us to be ruled by an understanding, a rational understanding of our long-term good and our long-term interests. And it requires us to have the stability to make a commitment to that long-term good. So none of that is possible if we have a kind of short-term outlook on desire, or if desire is making the decisions. It's not going to allow us to develop our capacities and to exercise self-mastery. Okay, let's see what we can pick out from this week in terms of conclusions that we've brought out of chapter 4, which, like I said, is a really important and pivotal chapter in the book, and gives us the first important answer to the problem of justice. And it's in the theory of the soul, as we saw, that provides the first answer to Glaucon's question. There is an arrangement of human faculties that is according to nature, Socrates argues, and that helps us to reach self-fulfillment. So if we sort of arrange ourselves that way, in a way that's according to nature, that's where human happiness lies. That's where self-fulfillment lies, not in letting desire take the lead and make decisions about sort of its own sort of short-term needs that don't speak to our idea of self-fulfillment. We identified the 4 virtues in the just city: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. We saw where they're located, and we saw that justice is defined as everybody minding their own business, or in other words, every part fulfilling its proper function, everything in its proper place. That's Socrates' sort of functional idea of justice. Every part of the city is doing its function. Every part of the soul is fulfilling its proper function and not trying to do something it's not naturally suited for. And thirdly, we see Adeimatus complain about, at the beginning of the chapter, about Socrates' treatment of the guardians. This problem will be raised to a crescendo in chapter 5, and it's again the problem will recur of how to raise public spirited citizens and what the consequences are of trying to raise a class of citizens who will be entirely dedicated to the public good.